Hello everyone and welcome to a new video. This week I'm back with another Sewing Through the Decades project. If you're unfamiliar with this series and these projects as a whole, I have a video that explains it in more detail, as well as a playlist of previous videos in this series, which I will all link up above as well as in the description box down below. In this series, I follow original historical patterns from every decade of the 20th century. And I've already followed two from 1900 and one from the 19s, which means we are officially into the 1920s. To be honest, the 1920s is one of my least favorite periods in the 20th century. I respect it for being so different from all of the fashion that came before it and all of the fashion that followed it, but I don't think it's a very flattering style on 99.9% of the population, and unfortunately I am part of that 99.9% of the population. It's really difficult to motivate yourself to make a dress that you don't feel good in. There are definitely styles from the 20s that I do like and dresses from that period that I would like to recreate, but they tend to be the exception rather than the rule. Despite not loving how it looks on me, I did enjoy the construction process of this piece, and I really like the pattern that I purchased. It's kind of an interesting design. I think it was a good choice for this series. So I hope you enjoy seeing me piece it together and what the end result looks like. But before getting into this video, I just want to remind you guys that this project and this entire series are funded by my Patreon. So if you've been enjoying these videos and you want to see more of them, as well as more behind the scenes footage, then please consider checking out and supporting my Patreon. It'll be linked down below. And on that note, let's go ahead and get started. The pattern I picked for this project is not dated, but very clearly depicts the dropped waist, boxy silhouette, which was trendy in the latter half of the 1920s. The pattern I chose is number 6248 and doesn't list a brand. It has a pleated front and back with a flat yoke and fitted sleeves. The dress is finished with a contrasting belt and bow. Like the previous three projects I followed in this project, this was cut in a single size, with guidelines marked using perforations as opposed to ink. We are still a few years off from that technology. This pattern also only has a mere paragraph of instructions, but luckily they were easier to follow than the 19's pattern. That one will haunt me for a while. The fabric I picked for this piece is a medium weight striped cotton sateen. I really struggled to find a printed fabric with a subtle sheen that was crisp enough to support the pleats, but not so heavy that it would look stiff. I don't think this was an awful choice, but I do wonder if a linen or lighter cotton would have made the dress more flattering, since it would have had a more natural drape. I know very light, almost sheer fabrics were favored during this period, but they don't lend themselves well to this structured design, which clearly used an opaque material. I also used some satin charmeuse and orange sari fabric for adding details to the dress and matching hat. Before beginning on actual construction, I typed out the instructions that were on the pattern sleeve. Seeing them spaced out as actual steps instead of a block of text makes them way easier to follow. I also changed the pattern letters to names of the corresponding pieces, so instead of it saying sew B to D as notched, it says sew front to back. It's way easier to follow along to. Here is the pattern tissue I was working with. You might be thinking, wait, that looks like a lot more than 5 pieces. And you would be right. Funnily enough, this 5-piece pattern came with 10 pieces, and only 3 of them belonged to this dress, and one of them was damaged. So I had to use math and the display picture on the pattern sleeve to redraft the missing pieces and repair the other. I show that process in a Patreon exclusive vlog. If you are interested in seeing it, then definitely check out the link below. Like with the previous pattern, rows of large circular perforations mark the grain line and waistline. Smaller circles are used to mark the pleat points, notches indicate where the pieces should connect, and edges with these diamonds are supposed to be placed on the fold. It's not rocket science, but this pattern had clearly been used before, so these perforations had become misshapen, and it was hard to tell what meant what. Now I could finally begin laying the pieces out on my striped fabric, and I quickly realized that the front pattern was 2 inches wider than this material. Luckily I knew from my mock-up that this pattern was too big for me and needed to be taken in by about that much, so I just ignored it and kept pinning. I have in fact made mock-ups for all of these pieces before constructing them. It gives me a chance to figure out the instructions and make sure the garments fit me before cutting into more expensive materials. I believe you should do this for all patterns regardless of what decade they come from. For this one, the alterations were pretty minor, just taking in the sides and lowering the arm side to make up for that. This pattern also specifically says allow for hems, so I added 2 inches to the bottom of the dress portions. As I said earlier, perforations are used to indicate where the pleats will be, so I'm using chalk to transfer those perforation points onto the right side of my fabric. I'm also flipping the fabric over and repeating this on the other side. This really is the easiest step ever, but I clearly wasn't paying enough attention. I kept forgetting which perforations I had marked, and I swear I ended up going over some of them about 7 times. As soon as the perforations were marked, I set the fabric aside. When doing this, preferably put it in place where it won't be moved much or rubbed against. That can cause the chalk to come off, and then you have to repeat the process. Now I'm repeating this process with the back panel and cutting out the rest of the dress. Also, I ironed the pattern before doing any of this. That is the only way I found to unfold them and remove creases without tearing them to shreds. It's also super satisfying. I wish all fabric ironed as well as tissue paper. Then maybe I would do it more often. At this point, I realized it would be way more exciting to cut the yoke on the bias, so I unpinned it and set it aside. I also remembered just in time to mark the hem allowance for the back panel, which was lucky. I cut the yoke so the long edge lined up with a horizontal stripe. I also added a 1/2 inch seam allowance to the center front since this was originally supposed to be cut on a fold. And I only cut out one side at a time since I wanted to make the stripes match up. After cutting out one side, I flipped it over and used it as a guide for cutting out the other side. I made sure the striped pattern on these were identical, then cut it out. These will get sewn together later, but I want to focus on the pleated panels first. That's also what the pattern instructed me to do. Its exact words were, to form plaits in B and C, crease on lengthwise lines of small perforations and bring these perforations over to the corresponding lines of large perforations. Press to position. So easy enough, it's basically just knife pleats folded towards the side edges of the panel. But there were two things that threw me off about this instruction. One was, what the hell is a plait? I would have assumed it was a spelling error, but it came up on another pattern too. I've obviously heard this word before referenced to braiding, but never to a garment. But a quick Google search has kindly informed me that this is also an archaic term for pleat. So that's that. My second confusion was over it instructing me to plait, B and C. B is the front panel, which makes sense, but C is the yoke, and there's no way this should be pleated for this design. Luckily, during my mock-up construction, I figured this out. I realized they probably meant pleat D, not C. D is the back panel and is shown pleated in the drawing of the completed garment. The pattern piece for it also has perforations, like the ones on the front panel. So since I'm such a rebel, I chose to follow that, despite what the instructions say. To be honest, I think the most rebellious thing I've done, aside from this, is use semi-permanent purple hair dye, and that wasn't even rebellious, that was just so awesome my parents couldn't understand it. Our next instruction was join upper edge of B to lower edge of C and ease fullness of B to fit C, which means sewing the yoke to the front panel, but before doing that I had to sew my yoke pieces together, since I cut them on the diagonal to create an interesting design as opposed to cutting them on the fold. To do this, I ironed the pieces thoroughly, then pinned them together, making sure the pins went through the same stripes on both panels. You want them to line up as closely as possible. Then these were stitched together with the 1/2 inch allowance. And off camera, I ironed the seam open, and I'm happy to report that the stripes did line up. Then the yoke was pinned into the front panel. I only pinned one side at a time since a sharp angle makes it tricky to pin all at once. I sewed this on using the stripes on the yoke as a guide as opposed to a traditional seam allowance. Once I reached the center, I backstitched, made sure the needle was down, then lifted the foot and turned the fabric. I pinned the other side, then stitched it the same way as the other. And then it was ironed. I really like how the seam aligns perfectly with the diagonal stripes. That's why I chose to follow them as opposed to the traditional seam allowance. I think this came out surprisingly well. I don't have a lot of experience sewing seams with such sharp angles, but now I want to try and incorporate it into more of my designs, since it really isn't that hard. Now we are moving on to step 3 and 4, which are join C to D at the shoulder edges and join B to D at the underarm edges. So I'm pinning the front and back panels together at the shoulders and side seams. The shoulders are sewn with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. They have this marked as a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, but it isn't that different, and we've already established that I'm rebellious. I actually stitched the side seams with almost 1 inch wide seams. Again, I was more concerned with the stripes sitting nicely than having perfect seam allowances. And I knew from my mock-up that this ran large on me, even with the material I removed from the side seams when cutting. And while I was at the sewing machine, I decided to hem the skirt as well. This way I could iron the hem and side seams at the same time. There aren't any notes about the hem, so I chose to turn the bottom edge inward by a 1/2 inch by machine. Then using chalk, I marked a line 4 inches away from the bottom edge of the skirt. The bottom edge of the fabric was turned upward until it touched that line, then pinned down. I sewed this edge down using a cross stitch. This stitch is kind of complicated to explain, but I do have a hemming tutorial showing it in more detail, which will be linked up above. I like this stitch because it is pretty much invisible from the right side of the fabric, since you're only catching a few threads of material at a time. It is definitely worth learning if you like hand sewing hems. Now the side seams and hems were thoroughly ironed, which is hard to do without messing up the pleats. I ended up placing a book underneath the parts I was ironing to prevent the heat from penetrating the material and causing creases on the other side. But even with that helping, it was still a tricky and time-consuming process. After the ironing was done, this is what the dress looked like. It was pretty much finished aside from binding and sleeves. For binding, I'll be using the brown cotton sateen that I showed earlier. I'm also using this material to cut out lining for the belt. After that was cut, I used a ruler to mark 2-inch wide strips on the fabric's diagonal grain line. These strips will be used to bind the neckline and the cuffs of the sleeves. Now for pinning. I folded the end of the binding outward and pinned it to the center seam in the yoke. Then I continued to pin the binding around the neckline of the dress, with the right sides facing each other. Once I neared the end, I trimmed off the excess and folded this end of the binding outward as well. This creates a cleaner finish. And this was all sewn on with a 1/2-inch seam allowance. Then I set that aside and moved on to the sleeves. I'm a little embarrassed to admit that I totally neglected to follow their instructions for this. I must have somehow skipped over them. I don't recall attempting to implement these in my mock-up either. The instructions say, gather the fullness at long seam edge of E between single perforations into the space between double perforations. Close the long seam. I did notice that one edge of the sleeve was slightly longer, but I assumed this was a mistake on my part since the sleeve was torn and I had to redraft part of it. I think the side that was missing must have also had the perforations they mentioned. So even if I had been aware of this step, I wouldn't have been able to execute it as they instruct. But I would have tried if I had seen this step. I really don't know how I skipped over it. So instead of following their instructions, I pinned the side seams of the sleeves normally and stitched them together with a 1/2-inch seam allowance. I ironed that seam, then began pinning the binding around the cuffs, just like I did with the neckline. There are no instructions mentioning this process, but it looks like contrasting binding was used in the sketch of the completed piece, so that is what I chose to do. The binding for the cuffs was sewn on with a 1/2-inch seam allowance too. I folded the binding for the cuffs down, then ironed it, and I used a sleeve roll to make this process easier. And I repeated this process on the binding that I sewed around the neckline. Then I folded the binding inward and pinned it down. I planned on folding the raw edge of the binding inward twice, like double fold bias tape, but it was really hard to get it even since I didn't iron the folds in place before sewing it on. So I turned it inward once and left it at that. Not ideal, but cotton sateen doesn't fray much, especially when it is cut on the bias, and this won't be visible when the garment is worn. Not the end of the world, but not ideal either. And then I repeated those steps on the cuff as well. Now I could stitch the binding down. I was going to do this by hand, but I think most aspects of this garment would have been sewn by machine in the 1920s, so I decided to stitch this by machine too. All the binding was thoroughly ironed after sewing. And now it is time to combine the sleeves and the dress into a dress that has sleeves. The instructions on this were fit E to arm side with seam at underarm seam and single perforation towards front. Ease any fullness over shoulder. This was easy to do but difficult to film. Hopefully you guys are familiar with this process if you've sewn before. The sleeves were sewn on with approximately a 1/2-inch seam allowance, but it did get a little uneven at points because the arm side was stretchy as hell and I was more focused on preventing puckering than having the edges line up perfectly. When the sleeves were on, I did another batch of ironing, and now it was time for the belt. The belt is just 2 rectangles pinned together with the right sides facing each other. Those 2 rectangles were then sewn together with 1/2-inch seam allowances. I used my normal technique to turn this tube the right way out, which consists of threading a large blunt needle with heavy-duty thread, or in this case, ribbon. Use it to stitch through one side of the tube and not the thread, then thread the needle through the tube until it comes out the other end. Give the thread a solid tug and the tube should start to turn itself right side out. Once that was done, I ironed the belt and sewed up the only seam with a French seam. The pattern does have the waistline marked, which I originally thought was marking the belt placement, but when I pinned the belt there, it was obviously too high. I ended up lowering it by a good 6 inches until it sat around my hips. The instructions say arrange F on dress when worn, which I should have taken to heart, because I sewed it on kind of unevenly on my first try. I ended up removing all of the tacking stitches you can see me adding here, and redoing it shortly thereafter. Aside from the pins, this dress was done, but I thought it needed a little extra something. I cut out, or rather tore, 2 strips of ivory silk charmeuse that were 4 inches wide. I sewed these into tubes with the right sides facing each other, then turned them the right side out and tied them into bows. I still tie bows like I learned to tie my shoes when I was 5, make the bunny ears, and then the bunny goes through the hole. Might be childish, but it works. This was sewn onto the center front, just below the binding. I planned on adding another bow to the side of the belt, but I thought it looked better without it. So this is my final dress. I paired it with a wool hat, which I molded and trimmed into something more appropriate for the 1920s. I really like the hat, but I must say I'm not a big fan of this dress. The silhouette makes me look and feel about 50 pounds heavier. And I can't make it tighter or else the pleats will lose their shape. I don't think the crisp texture of this fabric helped in making the piece attractive, but I also doubt it was the main cause of the brick-like appearance this dress has on me. But let me know what you think. Maybe as a Patreon reward I could make it from a flowier fabric and see if there's a difference. Aside from the fit of this dress, the pattern was nice and easy enough to follow, though the typo out pleating the yoke caught me off guard, and I'm still not entirely sure how I should have done the sleeves. Regardless, that is going to be the end of this video. I really hope you enjoyed it. If you did, giving it a like and a comment really helps me out. You can also support this project and series by contributing to my Patreon, which will be linked down below. It gets you early access to videos and tons of exclusive content. Thank you so much for watching, and I shall talk to all of you very soon.